The hegemony of united species had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time nobody had ever challenged their power or questioned their methods. High Assessor Vryn sat in his office aboard the cataloging station and looked at the data scrolling across his screen with the same boredom he felt every day, because this was routine work and nothing ever surprised him anymore. His species, the Velthari, had blue-gray skin and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on their faces, and they were known throughout the galaxy as the perfect bureaucrats because they never let emotion interfere with their duties. Another batch of systems to review, his assistant Kellogg said as he entered the room carrying a data tablet. Vryn waved one of his 4 hands dismissively and said, "Just put them on my desk and I will get to them when I finish my current work." Kellogg hesitated at the door and said, "There is one system that the survey teams flagged as priority because it has unusual readings." This caught Vryn's attention because unusual readings could mean valuable resources or dangerous anomalies, and both required his personal review. He took the tablet and scrolled through the information until he found System 7-291G, which was located in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy, far from any major trade routes or strategic positions. The system had a yellow dwarf star at its center with 8 planets orbiting around it, and the 3rd planet showed strong biosignatures, indicating abundant life. Primitive electromagnetic emissions detected. Vryn read aloud, and his interest faded immediately because this was nothing special at all. The 3rd planet's inhabitants were broadcasting radio signals into space, which meant they had developed basic technology, but nothing that could threaten the hegemony in any way. Vryn pulled up the species assessment file and saw bipedal mammals with 2 arms and 2 legs and soft skin that offered no natural protection against weapons or harsh environments. They call themselves humans. Kellogg offered helpfully and added, "Their planet is called Earth in their primary language." Vryn made a dismissive sound and said, "Another pre-space flight civilization with delusions of importance and no understanding of their place in the universe." He had seen thousands of species like this during his career, and they all followed the same pattern of development before the hegemony arrived to harvest their world. The hegemony did not conquer planets in the traditional sense because that would require maintaining armies and administrators and dealing with rebellions and other inconveniences. Instead, they simply took what they wanted and left nothing behind. A harvested world would be stripped of all valuable resources, including minerals and water and atmosphere and biological material, and when the hegemony finished, there would be nothing left but a dead rock floating in space. Some species were kept alive as slaves or specimens for study, but most were simply eliminated because they offered nothing of value beyond the resources their bodies contained. Vryn checked the standard assessment criteria for Earth and found everything in order. The planet had abundant water and diverse biological material and various minerals worth extracting, and the native species posed no military threat whatsoever. Category 3 harvest. Vryn announced and began filling out the standard forms that would seal Earth's fate. Category 3 meant the inhabitants would be eliminated quickly before harvesting began because they were too primitive to be useful as slaves and not interesting enough to preserve as specimens. Kellogg watched his superior work and asked, "Should we send a survey team for closer observation before scheduling the harvest?" Vryn shook his head and replied, "There is no need to waste resources on a primitive world like this one, because we already have all the information we require." He stamped the approval code on the harvest order and transmitted it to Fleet Command, where Admiral Essex would assign the appropriate ships and personnel. Earth would be harvested within 10 solar rotations, and nobody in the hegemony would think about it ever again, because this was simply how things worked. What Vryn did not know was that humanity was not as ignorant as his assessment suggested 50 years earlier. The humans had detected faint signals coming from deep space and brilliant Scientists had worked in secret to decode them and understand their meaning. Those signals had revealed the existence of the hegemony and its harvesting practices. And the humans had realized that someday their world would become a target. They could not build a fleet to defend themselves because their technology was too primitive. And they could not hide because the hegemony sensors would eventually find them. So they had chosen a different path deep beneath the ice of Antarctica and the sands of the Sahara and the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Humanity had discovered something that changed everything. Ancient structures buried miles below the surface had been waiting there for 65 million years, and the humans had spent decades trying to understand what they had found. They did not fully understand it yet, but they understood enough to know that Earth was not just another primitive world waiting to be harvested, and they had prepared a message. At the edge of Earth's solar system, a small probe drifted in the darkness between planets, and it had been watching and waiting and recording everything. When the hegemony survey ships had scanned Earth, the probe had detected them. And when Vrin had signed the harvest order, the probe had intercepted the transmission. Now the probe's ancient systems came to life for the first time in decades, and it began broadcasting on every frequency. The hegemony monitored. The message was not a plea for mercy, because humanity had learned from the intercepted signals that the hegemony did not understand mercy. The message was not a declaration of war, because humanity knew they could not win a conventional conflict against such overwhelming force. The message was something else entirely. It was a warning, and it would change the galaxy forever. In his office, Rin had already forgotten about Earth and moved on to reviewing the next batch of systems, unaware that his routine harvest order had set in motion events that would shake the foundations of everything the hegemony had built. The probe's transmission raced across the stars at speeds that should have been impossible for human technology, and it carried with it secrets that had been buried since before the hegemony existed. Earth had been marked for death. But Earth had secrets of its own, and the galaxy was about to learn why some worlds should never be touched. Grand Admiral Desix was having a quiet evening in her private quarters when the alarms began screaming throughout her flagship. She was a Korathi, which meant she had dark red scales covering her entire body and a tail that she used for balance when walking, and sharp teeth that her ancestors had used for hunting prey millions of years ago. Now she used those teeth to curse as she rushed to the command center, where her officers were already gathered around the main display screen. "What is happening?" she demanded as soon as she entered the room. Her communications officer turned to face her with an expression she had never seen before on his face, and it took her a moment to recognize it as fear. "Admiral, we are receiving a transmission on all frequencies simultaneously, and the origin point is System 7-291. Desix frowned, because that system designation meant nothing to her, and she asked, "What is so special about that system?" "It was just marked for Category 3 harvest earlier today by Assessor Vren," another officer replied while pulling up the relevant files. "A primitive world is broadcasting on all our frequencies," Desix said with disbelief in her voice, and added, "That should not be possible with their level of technology." The communications officer swallowed nervously and said, "Admiral, the transmission is not just reaching us, it has been sent to every species in the galactic network using encryption methods we cannot identify." Desix felt a cold sensation spread through her body, because this was wrong, and everything about this situation violated what she knew about pre-spaceflight civilizations. "Show me the transmission," she ordered. The main screen flickered and then displayed a simple text header that read, "What sleeps here?" followed by a data packet larger than anything Desix had ever seen broadcast. She began reviewing the contents, and at first she did not understand what she was looking at. The data showed the history of Earth going back billions of years, with detailed recordings of events that no primitive species should have been able to document. She saw massive asteroids striking the planet and creating devastation that would have ended life on most worlds. But somehow life on Earth had survived and come back stronger. She saw ice ages that covered entire continents and volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for years and plagues that killed most living things, and through all of it life had refused to die. This planet has been through extinction-level events that would have sterilized any normal world. One of her science officers whispered, and his voice was filled with something between awe and terror. Essex continued watching and saw how life on Earth evolved with a speed and aggression that made no sense according to standard biological models. Every time something tried to destroy life on Earth, the survivors adapted and became more resilient and more dangerous than before. But it was the final section of the data that made Essex stop breathing. The transmission showed archaeological surveys conducted by the humans, revealing structures buried deep beneath the surface of their world. These structures were not human in origin. They were ancient beyond comprehension, with technology that made the hegemony's most advanced systems look like children's toys. The structures had been there for 65 million years, and they were still generating power and still functioning, and the humans had been studying them for decades. Builders, Essex whispered, and the word carried weight because everyone in the galaxy knew the legends about the builders long before the hegemony existed and long before any current species had evolved. There had been another civilization that spanned the stars. Nobody knew what they looked like, or where they came from, or what had happened to them, but they had left traces throughout the galaxy. Most of those traces were broken and dead and useless, but the legend said that some of their technology still worked if you could find it and understand it. The humans had found it, and they had been learning to understand it. The transmission ended with a single message translated into every non-galactic language. We are not the first intelligent species to evolve here, and we are the first to survive long enough to find what the others left behind, and we suggest you approach with caution, because we certainly have. Essex stood in silence for a long moment, while her officers waited for her to say something. Finally, she turned to her communications officer and said, "Get me a direct line to the High Council immediately, and tell them this is a priority emergency that cannot wait." "What should I tell them?" the officer asked. Essex looked back at the screen where the image of Earth was still displayed and said, "Tell them that we may have just made the worst mistake in the history of the hegemony." She thought about all the worlds they had harvested over 12,000 years and all the species they had destroyed without a second thought, and wondered how many of those worlds might have held secrets like Earth, but those worlds had not known what was buried beneath their surfaces. Earth did, and Earth had prepared across the galaxy. The transmission was being received by hundreds of species, and each one was coming to the same realization that Essex had reached Earth was not pre-Earth, was something else entirely, and the hegemony had just announced their intention to attack it. The panic began spreading before the High Council even received Esex's message. Species that had lived under hegemony, rule for thousands of years, began questioning whether their masters were as powerful as they had always claimed. Others began reaching out to Earth through back channels, seeking alliance or information, or simply trying to understand what was happening. Hegemony's communication networks became overloaded with traffic as everyone tried to learn more about the primitive world that had just revealed itself to be anything but primitive, and in the depths of Earth's oceans and beneath its deserts and inside its mountains, ancient systems that had been dormant for millions of years began to wake up. The humans had sent their message now. They waited to see how the galaxy would respond, and they prepared for whatever would come next. The High Council of the Hegemony had not gathered in emergency session for over 300 years because nothing had threatened their power in all that time. Now, 12 representatives from the ruling species sat around a circular table in the heart of the capital world and argued with each other while their empire began to crumble around them. Supreme Chancellor Morvax presided over the meeting with growing frustration as his council members shouted accusations and demands without reaching any useful conclusions. Morvax was ancient, even by the standards of his long-lived species, and he had seen empires rise and fall throughout his lifetime, but he had never seen anything like this. We must destroy them immediately. Assessor Vryn argued from his seat at the table, and his four eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. Before they fully understand what they have found, we must send every available ship to that system and reduce their planet. To Ash, Admiral Essex shook her head and replied, "Did you not examine the technical readouts from their transmission? Because I have spent the last 6 hours reviewing that data, and what I found terrifies me." She activated the holographic display in the center of the table and showed images of the structures buried beneath Earth's surface. These are builder installations, and they are still generating power after 65 million years, and the energy signatures we detected suggest they are capable of output levels that exceed anything in our arsenal. All the more reason to destroy them before the humans learn to use that power. Vryn insisted, and what if destroying Earth activates defensive systems we cannot predict? Essex countered with anger in her voice. What if the builders left weapons behind that will fire automatically if their technology is threatened? The council chamber fell silent as everyone considered that possibility. Representative Kellanth of the Morvathi Collective spoke next, and her voice was calm despite the chaos around her. "I have reviewed our historical archives and found references to System 7, 291G, that predate our civilization by millions of years." She pulled up ancient records on the display and showed symbols that nobody in the room recognized. The archivists have confirmed that this system was flagged as forbidden territory by whoever controlled the galaxy before us, and the reason for that prohibition was never recorded, or has been lost to time. The archivists. Vryn spat the word with contempt and added, "Those ancient fools who spend their lives studying dead civilizations instead of building living ones. Those ancient fools have just released their complete files on Earth to the entire galactic network." Kellanth replied, and her words caused another wave of shouting around the table. The archivists were a species so old that nobody remembered when they had first appeared, and they had dedicated their existence to preserving knowledge from every era of galactic history. They had always remained neutral in political conflicts, and they had never taken sides in any war. But now they had broken their silence in a way that shook the foundations of the hegemony. Their released files showed that Earth had been marked as dangerous long before the hegemony existed and long before any current species had evolved. Something had happened in that system 65 million years ago, and whatever it was, that had been serious enough to make an entire galactic civilization declare the area off limits forever. The Kreth Dominion has issued a formal statement, another council member announced while reading from his data tablet. They are recognizing Earth as a sovereign world and withdrawing from all hegemony agreements. The Kreth have been looking for an excuse to break from us for centuries. Morvax said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "Their declaration means nothing. 3 more species have withdrawn their fleets from hegemony command in the last hour." Admiral Essex reported, and her voice was grim. 2 others have begun direct communications with Earth-seeking alliance. Morvax slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "They would betray 12,000 years of civilization because of one transmission from a primitive world. That primitive world has builder technology." Kellanth reminded him quietly. That primitive world survived extinction events that would have killed any other species in that primitive world. Just demonstrated the ability to broadcast on frequencies we cannot block using methods we cannot understand. She leaned forward and met the Chancellor's eyes directly as she continued. "Perhaps the other species are not betraying civilization, but simply choosing to side with whoever they think will win this conflict." The words hung in the Air like poison, and nobody dared to respond. For the first time in 12,000 years, the hegemony faced the possibility that they might not be the strongest power in the galaxy. And if they were not the strongest, then all the species they had conquered and exploited and harvested might decide that obedience was no longer in their best interest. Morvax looked around the table at his council members and saw fear in their eyes. Not fear of Earth or fear of the builders, but fear of what would happen if the hegemony's subjects realized their masters could be challenged. "We need more information," he finally said, and his voice was tired and old. "Admiral Essex will take a diplomatic fleet to Earth system and make contact with the humans and determine exactly what we are dealing with." Diplomatic. Vryn sputtered with outrage and asked, "You want us to negotiate with creatures we were planning to harvest yesterday? I want us to survive." Morvax replied, and for the first time Vryn saw real fear in the ancient chancellor's eyes. "Whatever is buried on Earth has been there since before our ancestors crawled out of the primordial seas of our homeworld. And if the humans have awakened, then we need to understand what we are facing before we do anything that cannot be undone." The council voted and the decision was made, and Admiral Essex began preparing her fleet for a mission unlike any she had undertaken before. She was going to meet the humans, and she was going to find out exactly what they had found beneath their world. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity watched the chaos spreading through the galaxy and knew that their gamble had worked. The message had bought them time. Now they needed to decide what to do with it. Dr. Sarah Chun stood in the chamber that should not exist and looked at technology that humanity had barely begun to understand. The chamber was 3 miles beneath the Antarctic ice, and the walls were made of a material that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, which made the space feel like it extended forever in all directions. Around her, a team of scientists and military officers worked at stations that combined human computers with alien interfaces that had been dormant for 65 million years. "The hegemony fleet will arrive in our system within 48 hours. General Marcus Morrison announced as he entered the chamber through the elevator that connected it to the surface. Sarah turned to face him and saw the weight of responsibility pressing down on his broad shoulders. Morrison was a tall man with gray hair and scars from conflicts that most people had forgotten, and he had spent his entire career preparing for threats that might never come. Now the threat had arrived, and it was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. "Our message bought U.S. time, but it will not save us forever," Sarah replied and gestured at the alien technology surrounding them. "The hegemony is scared and confused right now, but eventually they will decide that destroying us is worth whatever risk it involves, which is why we are here," Morrison said, and walked to the central console where the activation sequence waited for authorization. "Are you certain this will work?" Sarah hesitated before answering, because certainty was not something she could offer. 20 years ago, a mining operation in Antarctica had broken through into this chamber, and the discovery had changed everything humanity thought they knew about their world. The structures beneath Earth's surface were not natural formations, and they were not the work of any human civilization. They had been built by someone else, someone who had lived on Earth long before humans existed, and who had left behind technology that still functioned after millions of years. Sarah had spent 2 decades studying these systems and learning their language and understanding their purpose, and she still felt like a child trying to comprehend the work of gods. "I am certain that if we do nothing, the hegemony will eventually destroy us," she finally answered. "I am certain that this technology was left here for a reason, and I am certain that the previous intelligent species on Earth activated it before they disappeared." She paused and then added, "What I'm not certain about is what will happen when we turn it on." Morrison considered her words and then asked, "What happened to the species that was here before us?" "We do not know," Sarah admitted. "The records we have found suggest they were facing a threat from beyond Earth, and they activated these systems to defend themselves. but what happened after that is unclear. They might have been destroyed. Yes, or they might have won and then left Earth for some reason we cannot understand. Also, yes. Morrison stood in silence for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing the risks against the alternatives if they did nothing. The hegemony would eventually come for them, and humanity would be harvested like every other primitive species that had crossed paths with the Galactic Empire. If they activated the builder technology, they might save themselves, or they might trigger something catastrophic that would destroy them just as surely. The world governments have voted. Morrison finally said, and his voice was steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to authorize. We activate the systems and accept whatever consequences follow. Sarah nodded and turned to her team and gave the orders that would change human history forever. Activation sequence began with a low hum that vibrated through the chamber walls and spread outward through the rock and ice until it reached the surface across Earth. Similar chambers in different locations received the signal and began powering up for the first time in 65 million years. In the Sahara desert, sand shifted as something massive stirred beneath the dunes in the Pacific Ocean. The water began to glow with light that came from structures on the water began to glow with light that came from structures on the seabed that nobody had known existed in mountain ranges on every continent. Ancient systems connected to each other and formed a network that spanned the entire planet. And then the facility spoke. The voice came from everywhere at once, and it used a language that should have been incomprehensible. But the translation systems built into the technology converted it automatically into words Sarah could understand. Guardian systems online and threat assessment required and identify aggressors. Sarah's hands trembled as she input the data they had gathered about the hegemony and their harvest order and their fleet that was approaching Earth's system. The facility processed the information faster than any human computer could operate, and then it responded. Hegemony of United Species confirmed hostile and identified in historical records and previous encounters 65 million years ago, and resolution pending and Guardian protocols. Resuming, Sarah felt her blood run cold as she understood what the system was telling them. The builders had encountered the hegemony before, or at least the ancestors of the species that would eventually form the hegemony. They had fought a war 65 million years ago, and that war had never been finished. What are Guardian protocols? Morrison demanded. The facility answered his question not with words, but with actions. Across Earth, the ancient systems reached full power, and then they reached beyond the planet into the space, surrounding it in orbital positions that had been empty. Moments before energy signatures appeared, as ships emerged from dimensional folds where they had been stored waiting for this moment. Thousands of ships that had been built before the dinosaurs walked the Earth and preserved in perfect condition. By technology, humanity could not begin to replicate. Admiral Essex was still preparing her diplomatic fleet when her sensors detected the impossible. Where did they come from? She whispered as her screen filled with contacts that had not existed seconds before. Her officers had no answer because nothing in their experience or training had prepared them for what they were seeing. The human world that they had planned to harvest was now surrounded by a fleet larger than anything the hegemony could field, and those ships were beginning to move. Guardian fleet, acknowledging designated protectors, the facility announced, and Sarah realized with growing amazement what the builders had done. They had not just left technology behind, they had left an army, and that army had just recognized humanity as the inheritors of whatever war had begun 65 million years ago. Send a message to the hegemony fleet, Morrison ordered, and his voice carried the authority of a man who had just been handed weapons beyond his imagination. Tell them to hold position and wait for further instructions. For the first time in 12,000 years, the hegemony was not giving orders, they were receiving them, and humanity had just become the most powerful species in the galaxy. IJH Assessor Vryn sat alone in his quarters aboard the cataloging station and stared at the message on his screen with eyes that could no longer focus properly. His hands were shaking, and his skin had turned a pale gray color that indicated extreme stress in his species, and he had not eaten or slept since the Guardian fleet appeared around Earth. The message had come directly from the human government, and it was addressed to the entire Hegemony High Council, but Vryn had received a personal copy because he was the one who had signed the Harvest Order. He was the one who had started all of this. The message began with historical data that made Vryn want to scream because it revealed truths that the hegemony had buried for thousands of years, 65 million years ago. The ancestors of the species that would eventually form the hegemony had been a young civilization, just beginning to explore the stars. They had encountered the builders, and instead of approaching them with respect and curiosity, they had attacked them and tried to steal their technology. The war that followed had nearly destroyed both sides, and the builders had eventually withdrawn to a single world where they could defend themselves while they rebuilt their strength. That world was Earth. The builders had constructed the Guardian fleet and the defensive systems, and then they had entered a kind of sleep to wait for the threat to pass. But something had gone wrong. A catastrophic asteroid impact 65 million years ago had damaged their facilities and killed most of the builders before they could wake up. The survivors had programmed their systems to wait for the next intelligent species to evolve on Earth and to grant them access to everything the builders had created. They had left instructions explaining what had happened and expressing hope that whoever inherited their legacy would use it more wisely than their enemies had used their own power. The hegemony was built on the ruins of the civilization that had attacked the builders, and they had continued the same patterns of conquest and exploitation for 12,000 years. Now the inheritors of the builders had awakened, and they had a choice to make. The message continued with targeting data showing Guardian fleet positions around every major hegemony world. The weapons on those ships could crack planets apart, and they were now aimed at the heart of everything the hegemony had built. Vryn waited for the demands for surrender or the threats of destruction that he was certain would follow. Instead, the message took a different direction entirely. 65 million years ago, the builders found your ancestors, and they could have destroyed them, but instead they chose to sleep and wait to see if you would grow beyond conquest, and you did not. We are not the builders, and we are younger and angrier and far less patient, but we have read their records, and we have seen what they hoped the galaxy could become. The hegemony harvesting ends today, and not because we will destroy you if you continue, although we will, but because we are offering you the same choice the builders once offered. Grow and change, and join us in building something better. You have one solar cycle to respond. This is humanity's first and final offer, and we suggest you take it. We did not survive 4 billion years of extinction, events to be farmed by species who never learned to dream of anything beyond dominion. Earth endures, and now so will everyone else, whether the hegemony likes it or not. Vryn read the message 3 times before he fully understood what the humans were offering. They were not demanding revenge for the Harvest Order or punishment for the thousands of worlds the hegemony had destroyed. They were offering a chance to start over, a chance to become something better than conquerors and harvesters and destroyers. He thought about his career cataloging worlds for extinction, and he thought about all the species he had condemned to death with his signature, and he felt something he had not experienced in a very long time: shame. The hegemony had always told itself that conquest was natural and that the strong had the right to take from the weak, and that anyone who disagreed was simply too soft to survive in a harsh universe. But the humans had survived things that would have killed the hegemony 1,000 times over. They have faced extinction again and again, and they had never given up, and they had never stopped fighting. And now they stood at the top of the galactic order with power beyond anything the hegemony had ever possessed, and instead of using that power to destroy their enemies, They were offering mercy. Vryn began drafting the hegemony's response, and for the first time in his long career, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The High Council debated for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Guardian fleet had weapons that could end the hegemony in a matter of days, and the choice between accepting humanity's offer and facing annihilation was not really a choice at all. Supreme Chancellor Morvax announced the hegemony's surrender in a broadcast that reached every corner of the galaxy. The harvesting would end, and the conquered species would be freed, and the hegemony would transform itself from an empire of conquest into something new. It would take generations to undo the damage that 12,000 years of exploitation had caused, but the process had begun. Admiral Desix met with human representatives aboard her flagship and found them to be exactly what she had expected and nothing like what she had expected. At the same time, they were young and aggressive and filled with emotions that older species had learned to suppress, but they were also curious and hopeful and determined to build a better future. "Why did you offer us mercy?" Desix asked Dr. Sarah Chun during one of their meetings. "You could have destroyed us, and nobody would have blamed you for it." Sarah considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because destruction is easy and creation is hard, and we have always chosen the hard path." She smiled and added, "Also because the builders left us their records of what happens to civilizations that only know how to destroy, and we decided we did not want to become that." Desix nodded and felt something shift inside her that she could not quite identify. Perhaps it was hope in the archives of a dozen species. Historians would later mark this moment as the end of the first galactic age and the beginning of the second. The age of conquest was over. The age of cooperation had begun, and it had started because one small world refused to accept the fate that had been assigned to it. Earth had been marked for harvest. Instead, Earth had harvested the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same again.